Good evening. It's Mr. Evans, and we are still reading The Sugar Creek Gang by Paul Hutchens, and tonight we start with Chapter 9. Sleeping in that big canvas tent with poetry was the most fun I'd had in a long time. It was what is called a wall tent, about 8 feet high in the center and about 4 feet high at the side walls, with about 8 inches of sod cloth all around the bottom, and with the drop screen in front to keep out mosquitoes. Only there weren't many mosquitoes around in our neighborhood on account of us boys, and my pop especially, having poured oil on the surface of all the ponds and puddles in the swamp, being careful not to leave any water standing around in tin cans or kettles or things, 'cause that's where mosquitoes breed. You know, mosquitoes are funny things, the kind we have in our neighborhood being what Pop calls the Culex kind, which don't carry any diseases such as malaria or yellow fever. Pop knows the scientific names for the kinds that do carry diseases, but they're too hard for me to pronounce and I can't spell them anyway. As I said, mosquitoes are crazy things, crazy looking and crazy acting. Did you ever see those little wrigglers swimming around in your folks' rain barrel or in a can of water or something? Well, those ugly little wiggletails, as little Jim calls them, are baby mosquitoes, having hatched out of eggs which their mother laid in the water. Well, those little wrigglers keep growing and growing and wriggling until they're as big as they'll ever get. And then all of a sudden they stop wriggling and float up to the surface of the water, and they lie there just like they're dead, when pretty soon the skin bursts open all the way along the back, and out crawls a full-grown mosquito and flies away all ready to stick her sharp nose into somebody, inject a little poison, and suck out some blood, if she doesn't get slapped good and hard first. Say, does a mosquito bite ever itch? But if you put some soda water on it real quick, it'll feel a lot better right away. Well, my pop drove me over to Poetry's house and let me out at the front gate. Be sure to be a good boy, he said, which I didn't like to hear very well, because I'd heard it maybe 1,000,000 times in my life already. 1,000 times anyway. I guess maybe I needed it, though. Anyway, I wouldn't have liked it if my pop had wanted me to be bad, would you? So I called out cheerfully, I will, being willing to promise most anything because he'd been so good to let me stay all night with poetry in his tent. I carried my little brown suitcase proudly up the walk and around the house to where Poetry's tent was pitched under a big maple tree. Poetry was so glad to see me you would have thought he hadn't seen me for a whole year. He lifted up the drop screen at the front of the tent, which was made of what is called bobbinet, with a wide band of cheesecloth all around it for a border so it wouldn't tear so easy or wear out so quick. Pretty soon we were inside, and say, it was grand. There were 2 cots, one on each side, with an aisle about 3 feet wide between them. In a corner, Poetry had a nice little table with books and things on it, such as a pocket knife, a compass, and Poetry's little black leather New Testament. Poetry being the kind of Christian that was brave and wasn't ashamed to let anybody know about it, while at the same time he was an honest-to-goodness boy that everybody liked. Maybe he was a little more mischievous than some boys, but I felt proud to have a friend like him for my very best friend. Pretty soon it would be dark in the tent, so we decided to go outside. I'm glad you brought your binoculars, Poetry said, 'cause we might need them before morning, not explaining what he meant. However, we used them right away, looking around at different things. By standing up on Poetry's chicken house, we could look away across the field and see the chimney of our house and the big green ivy vine that almost covered the whole south side. You could see the big south window of my upstairs window, which I always kept open when I slept, even in winter, that being one of the reasons why I had such good health. Pretty soon, while Poetry and I were standing up on their chicken house, talking and thinking and liking each other awful well, Poetry's pop called out sharply from the barn, Leslie Thompson, get down off of there right this minute. You're too heavy for that roof. Don't you know it might smash in and kill a half dozen of your mother's finest laying hens? Not mentioning the fact that it might smash Poetry, too. All right, Poetry called and started to obey. I only weigh 140 pounds, he said to me. I guess me being so short makes me look like 200. In a little while it was dark, so we told Poetry's folks good night and went inside the tent, where Poetry struck a match, which he took out of a waterproof matchbox, the kind everybody ought to have when they go camping. And in a jiffy there was plenty of light to see to undress by, coming from a little kerosene lamp on the table in the corner. We'd already washed our feet good in an old foot tub just outside the tent door, and had put on our slippers, Poetry's mom making sure we did it so we wouldn't get her nice clean sheets all dirty. I guess nothing feels better than sleeping in a tent when you're a boy. We felt like real campers or forest rangers or something. Pretty soon we had on our pajamas and were sitting on the edges of our cots, kind of hating to turn out the light and crawl in. And I was wondering which one of us was going to say his prayers first. Maybe Poetry was thinking the same thing, because pretty soon he reached over and got his New Testament and handed it to me and said, "Let's read our chapters together tonight." I guess I forgot to tell you that Poetry and I had promised each other we'd read a chapter out of the New Testament at least once each day, and that we'd pray for each other by name every night. Well, I turned to the book of Acts, which is the 5th book of the New Testament, and read about 15 verses. Anyway, it was the story about Paul and Silas having to go to jail for preaching the gospel, and how they sang songs at midnight and were so happy because they loved Jesus so much in spite of being in jail, with their feet all fastened tight in big wooden clamps or something. And there was a big earthquake, and the jailer tried to kill himself with a sword, and instead became a Christian, and he and his whole family were baptized before morning. It was a great story, I tell you, and we liked it a lot. Poetry and I kind of liking each other like Paul and Silas did, and making up our minds that if we ever had to go to jail for being Christians, we'd do it, and we'd sing at midnight too, only we wouldn't exactly want there to be any earthquake. Then the two of us got down on our knees together beside Poetry's bed and said our prayers. Only this time Poetry didn't say his little poem prayer at all, but just talked to the Heavenly Father with his own words. He explained afterward that he was getting a little bit too big to just quote a little poem to God, so he decided to talk to him right out, knowing that he loved boys and Jesus had once been a boy himself. Soon the lights were out, and we were lying there in our cots, thinking and talking and telling each other stories, and looking through the little square hole at the top of the tent entrance, which was open for fresh air. Looking up at the sky with the stars looking down at us like they were our best friends, when Poetry started to say, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky." I always did like that poem, ever since I was little, so I made him quote all of it, liking especially the verse which goes, "In the dark blue sky you keep, and often through my curtains peep, for you never shut your eye till the sun is in the sky." Then we began to get sleepy, and in a minute we were gone. Say, did you ever wonder where a boy goes when he goes to sleep? Of course you don't really go anywhere, 'cause when you wake up, why, you're still right there in bed. Anyway, when I woke up a little later, hearing the queerest noise coming from up in the old maple tree somewhere right above our heads. It sounded like somebody was crying, or else moaning or wailing in a trembly voice. Of course, as soon as I was awake, I knew it was nothing but a screech owl, and nothing to be afraid of. I'd seen plenty of them in the daytime. They generally sit all alone in a hole in some old tree, sound asleep, waiting for night to come, so they can go mouse hunting or maybe cutworm hunting. Pop says they're one of the farmer's best friends, because at night cutworms cause the most trouble, cutting off the little corn shoots and beans and things like that. And since the screech owls hunt them at night, killing hundreds of them, boys ought never to kill any screech owls, no matter how much they don't like them. Poetry was awake too, and pretty soon he whispered, "Bill." "What?" I whispered back. "I've got an idea." I was still pretty sleepy, so I just grunted. "Remember Old Man Paddler?" Poetry asked. That woke me up quicker than anything. "Yes," I said, and then that screech owl let out another long, trembly wail that sent the shivers up and down my spine. It's a whole lot different when you're home and upstairs in bed, listening to an owl out in the woods, than it is sleeping in a tent, which is about the same as sleeping out of doors. But Poetry didn't pay any attention. He said, I asked my dad a lot of questions about Old Man Paddler when I got home tonight, without telling him anything, and he said that he was the kindest old man that ever lived, and that he especially liked boys. I didn't answer, just waiting to see what else Poetry'd have to say, because I knew he'd thought of something important. I could hear his bed springs squeaking like he was getting up. Wait till I scare that owl away and I'll tell you. He fumbled around for his flashlight, turned it on a minute, stepped into his slippers, raised the tent flap and went out, with me following right behind him, both of us in our pajamas looking like a couple of ghosts. He turned the flashlight up into the tree, and for a minute we saw Mr. Owl with his cat-like eyes blinking and looking very fierce and disgusted at us for not appreciating his entertainment. Then he spread his wings and flew like a shadow across the garden toward the barn. Maybe I forgot to tell you that old sycamore tree down along the swamp was nearer to Poetry's house than it was to any of the rest of the gang's, being not more than a quarter mile away. To get to it from Poetry's house, you had to go down a hill and through the woods. Well, we were standing there in the moonlight after the owl had flown away, when Poetry said so sudden-like that it startled me, if Old Man Paddler liked boys and was kind to them, and was even a Christian as Dad says he was, then that wasn't him we saw today. Do you know what I think? I think the man we saw today was wearing a wig and false whiskers. I saw his hands, and they weren't any more an old man's hands than anything. I'll bet he's some robber or somebody that's trying to make people think he's Old Man Paddler, so he can fool Barry Boylan and get the treasure. And I'll bet Barry knows there's a map that when his uncle died, he left his money somewhere and he's coming back to get it. But what about the disguise you found in the tree? I asked. I couldn't figure out what Poetry was driving at. They belonged to the man we saw today, and when I found them, he had to get some new ones. Well, that sounded sensible, and I told Poetry so. Also, Poetry said, just like a real detective explaining things, as long as Barry Boylan is in the hospital, it's up to us boys to protect his interests. Maybe we ought to tell the police, I said, thinking what my pop would say we ought to do. Not on your life. Think we want to have him spoil our fun? Well, I didn't want to argue with Poetry. Besides, his ideas were nearly always right. We started to go back into the tent when he stopped so quick I bumped into him. Listen, he said. I didn't hear anything, but I did see something that looked like a light down in the woods, maybe not far from the sycamore tree. Get your binoculars, quick, Poetry commanded under his breath. He handed me his flashlight, and in a jiffy I was in the tent and out again, and Poetry was looking through my binoculars down the hill toward where we knew the tree was. Look, he whispered and handed the binoculars to me. All I could see was a light and a shadow moving about it. We've got to do something quick, Poetry said. We won't even have time to dress. In a jiffy he was in the tent and out again with the disguise he'd found in the old tree day before yesterday. What are you going to do? I asked, my teeth chattering, and not because I was cold either, for it was a warm night. I noticed particularly that Poetry had on his big shoes, so I put mine on too real quick. Let's go or we'll be late, he said. Well, I didn't exactly want to run smack into any ghosts or whatever. It was down along the swamp, but I didn't want to seem like a coward either, so I followed him as fast as I could. The wind was blowing on our faces, so we knew whoever was there wouldn't hear us coming unless we made a lot of noise. Say, Poetry looked ridiculous in his big flapping white pajamas, and I guess I looked just as ridiculous running after him. He knew every inch of the woods along the creek here, so we just hurried along, me thinking his idea was still crazy. Well, dangerous anyway. When we got to the bottom of the hill, we stopped to get our breath and to look through the binoculars again. As plain as day, we could see an old-fashioned lantern, and a man was digging with a spade right beside the swamp rose bush where we'd been digging that afternoon. We'll have to hurry, Poetry said excitedly. Look what a big hole he's got already. We stooped down low and crawled along as quiet as we could until we were real close. So close if we'd made any noise he'd have heard us, and that would have spoiled everything. And we could see the man, too, the same old man we'd seen in the afternoon, with the long white hair and the long beard, and he was working terribly fast. Then I looked at Poetry and guessed what he was going to do, for he was putting on the whiskers and the wig which he had brought with him. Listen, he whispered in my ear, you lie flat on the ground right here, and when I let out a long ghost laugh, you turn on the flashlight on me real quick, and leave it on until I start moaning and talking crazy, and then you turn it off. And when I start laughing again, you turn it on quick. Poetry stood up then and started waving his arms like a crazy man, and then with that squawky voice of his that sounded more like a ghost than any real ghost could have sounded, he let out a blood-curdling wail that sounded like a screech owl with a bad cold. I turned the flashlight on him just as he started that wailing, and honest, if I hadn't known who it was, I'd have been scared almost to death. For he was waving his arms and his pajamas were flapping crazily, and it was enough to scare anybody. Then Poetry started the awfulest moaning you ever heard and sang slowly, I am Old Man Paddler's ghost, yelling the word ghost real loud, but with a low voice like a man's voice. Then Poetry let out that terrible laugh that sent the shivers up and down my spine again, and I turned the flashlight on him and watched him waving his white pajamas and looking even worse like a ghost. Well, sir, that man dropped his spade and looked around like he was awful scared, and in a flash he jumped up and dashed lickety-sizzle straight towards Poetry, with both hands stretched out in front of him like he was going to grab Poetry and choke him to death. But just that second, two shadows darted out from behind some bushes, and one of them made a dive for the man's legs in real football style, and a voice, it was Big Jim's voice, yelled for us to come and help. I tell you, I was glad to hear Big Jim's voice, for to tell the truth, I was pretty badly scared, not wanting to let Poetry know it. It turned out that Big Jim and Circus, who lived right across the road from each other, had decided maybe they'd better stand on guard tonight for fear somebody would spoil everything, and so they'd hidden themselves in the bushes, having gotten there just a few minutes before we did, coming up the creek from the other direction. In a jiffy, all four of us boys, Big Jim and Circus and Poetry and I, were scrambling all over that man. His old white hair and whiskers came off just like Poetry thought they would, and we saw that he had black hair, the same color as the radio had said the bank robber was supposed to have had. Say, he struck out with his big fists and kicked and swore, and one of his fists caught me on the chin and knocked me flat, but didn't hurt much, 'cause I was so mad. And things don't seem to hurt so much when you are. Anyway, you don't feel them at the time. But I didn't stay down. In a second, I was right in there in the thick of the fight. I got there just in time to see Poetry's big right foot with his heavy shoe on it kick that man squash right on the shin of his right leg, and I heard the man let out a yell of pain, and I was glad right that minute that Poetry had big feet. I dived in head first and got hold of one of the man's legs, and Circus the other, and we held on like a couple of bulldogs, or maybe like a couple of snapping turtles holding onto a boy's toe. Pretty soon we had the man down on his stomach, with Poetry lying right across his shoulders and head. Big Jim knew all the best wrestling tricks, and as I told you before, he was terribly strong. Well, he'd gotten that man's arm behind him in what is called the arm grapevine hold, and that's how it had been so easy for us to get him down and keep him there, in spite of the man's yelling and kicking and swearing and threatening to kill us. Afterward, we learned another reason why it had been so easy to keep him down, for when he was locked up in jail next day, he had one eye swollen almost shut, where Big Jim had hit him with his fist in the fight we'd had. It took Big Jim's knuckles almost a week to get completely well. He'd hit the man so hard. Anyway, that's where little Jim's gunny sack came in handy, for we'd left it there, you know, when we'd been scared away in the afternoon. As I told you, Big Jim knew how to tie 21 different kinds of knots. Well, he knew how to make ropes, too. He took his knife and cut that sack into strips and twisted them together, and in almost no time we had that robber's legs and hands tied so he couldn't get away. After we got him tied, we didn't know what to do with him. "What'll we do with him?" Big Jim asked. "Let's bury him," Circus suggested, not meaning it, of course. He's got his grave already dug. Say, that started our prisoner to swearing like I'd never heard any man swear before in my life. And I was glad little Jim wasn't there, because he just naturally loved Jesus so much that when anybody used his name like that, it made little Jim feel terribly bad. The man began to kick and squirm and try to get loose, not knowing that Big Jim was an expert at tying knots. Then all of a sudden Circus let out a yell and picked up something shiny that had been lying right there on the ground by the man's lantern. At first I could hardly believe my eyes, but there it was in Circus's hand as plain as day, a real honest-to-goodness revolver. I guess our faces were pretty sober right then, for we realized how serious things were, and how maybe one of us might have been shot or killed. I didn't tell any of the boys, although I did tell Poetry later, but I just shut my eyes for a minute and whispered a thank you prayer. "Dear God," I said, "thank you for not letting any of us boys get killed." And I was thankful too, I can tell you. Big Jim took the gun and opened it and saw that it was loaded. And then he said grimly in a voice that sounded awful fierce, "And now, mister, whoever you are, I've got your gun pointing straight towards you. You lie still while we get the sheriff." Poetry was delegated to run home for his pop, which he did. His pop phoned the sheriff, and then came down himself to help us guard the robber until the sheriff got there. After that, we all went home and went to bed. That is the end of our chapter this evening. I will see you tomorrow night, and we will start with chapter 10. Have a good night.